Imagine for a moment that everything you believe about death is. Imagine that behind the last blink of eyes there is a reality so vast that no doctrine or science has been. Now imagine hearing this not from an anonymous mystic, but from a practical, rational man, shaped by the rigors of military operations, who never sought attention. A man who died for 1 hour and 24 minutes and returned with something that seemed bigger than him, bigger than any religious system, bigger even than his own capacity to understand. This is the story that begins here. And if you decide to continue, you'll need to do so with an open mind, a willing heart. Because what you are about to hear calls into question the way we understand life, old age, death, even ourselves. Michael Torres wasn't one for the extraordinary. He rarely spoke about spirituality and always believed that life was above all responsibility, hard work. Perhaps that's why his experience. That quiet morning he was working on an old chair that had belonged to his grandmother. Something symbolic about it, though he didn't realize it. The old wood, marked by time, by the hands that had already left, by stories that no one else knew how to tell. It was almost as if life was trying to speak to him before electric shock ripped him from. He tightened the tool, heard a dry crack in the hand bite. No time to cry for help. No slow transition. Silence. Silence didn't last. Michael regained consciousness. He didn't return to himself. He returned above himself. He observed his motionless body on the floor, burn marks as if a stranger. That was the first shock, realizing he was alive without being in his body. The second surprise came soon after. The feeling wasn't one of confusion or despair. Freedom so profound it seemed indecent, as if he had shed a weight he had carried his entire life without realizing it. How to explain this? How to translate into words something that doesn't belong to the human? Michael tried to describe it, but every comparison seemed. And the light arrived. It wasn't a light that hurts, nor a light that demands reverence. It was a light that welcomes, light that recognizes. The center of that light walked a figure whose words needed no introduction. He wasn't like the paintings you saw in childhood, but he carried their essence. Each step emitted a presence that cannot be described, only felt. Michael immediately understood that he was not the Jesus of catechism, not the Jesus of artistic representations, archetypal Jesus, Jesus who embodies what Carl Jung called the totality of the psyche, self, deepest and most universal image, ultimate meaning. Figure spoke his name. He didn't call him for judgment nor consolation. He called him with the objectivity of one who awakens a soldier for a decisive mission. It was at that moment that Michael realized something that marked him more than death itself. He had not been taken to witness the end, receive a warning, perhaps even a summons. Jesus told him that something significant would happen between the 1st and 8th of December, and that the elders, those who had already gone through the pains and cycles of life, would be central to this process. Michael, still gripped by disbelief, listened with a mixture of fear and responsibility. Why him? Why would an ordinary man, a retired veteran, be chosen to see something so grand? This question echoed in his mind. Perhaps it's the same one you're asking yourself now. There was another concern that arose as he counted everything. What exactly was about to happen in those days? Why involve precisely those society usually? Perhaps the most disturbing question, why did the message seem to carry such a strong, almost desperate sense of urgency? Time were running out. Michael finished describing that first encounter. It was a mixture of fear, reverence, weight he himself didn't want to carry. He hadn't asked for this audit. Now it rested upon falling, and we're moving on to the other parts of the experience. Said something I couldn't. I saw wasn't just about me, about all of us, especially about those who live. The last part of life is just isn't. And it is precisely here that the most important question of this first part arises. A rational man, trained to distrust the impossible, returned with such a specific, urgent, and deeply connected warning. What exactly is behind it? The answer, according to him, would begin to reveal itself next step of the vision. But what he saw next was neither gentle nor metaphorical. It was direct, intense, and absolutely challenging to. The second part begins exactly where the first ends. Boundary between where the human soul reveals more than science has ever been able to. Want to move forward? Then come prepared. Because from here on out, the story ceases to be merely extraordinary, inevitably begins to become transformed. Michael awoke in that space, which was neither heaven as we imagine. Form of sensation was that his consciousness described it as seeing the world from a height that defied logic. It wasn't exactly physical altitude, but something like perceiving the collective psyche of an entire country. If millions of lives were intertwined, seen. It was then that Jesus touched his shoulder, not physical contact, but a firm presence. Directed his gaze to what was about to happen between 1st and 8th. There began the most difficult part of the vision, revelation that something profound would awaken in the He saw the United States as if it were made of transparent layers. In each layer there were elderly people, simple houses, nursing homes, hospitals, quiet neighborhoods, outlying towns, people over 60, 70, 80, ordinary people, grandparents who spend their afternoons watching television, gentlemen who await visits that almost never come, women who spend their days remembering their children who have grown up and moved away, men who feel their usefulness of the past. Michael observed all this not with pity but with brutal clarity. These were the people who carried a flame that almost no one else saw. That's when the visions began. He saw an 83-year-old woman in a small house in rural Ohio. Just finished making tea when she felt a presence in her. Looked around thinking it was her imagination, but the presence grew stronger. Suddenly she began to cry without understanding why. Hands trembled, but it was something like a profound recognition, discovering a part of herself that had been dormant for decades. This woman, who rarely received visitors, having an experience no one could explain, simple psychological term. Elsewhere, Michael saw a 79-year-old man sitting in a wheel. He was in the courtyard of a nursing home watching birds. Suddenly, he heard a voice inside him, clear as if someone were speaking beside him. The voice spoke words of courage, strength, and purpose. He tried to ignore it, believing it to be the result of medication or old assisted. First time in years, felt the urge to stand up. Body wouldn't obey. More than a voice. Falling. This man hesitated, not out of disbelief, as society had taught him that old age is synonymous with weakness and dependence. At that moment that Michael realized the magnitude of the conflict, something supernatural awakened. First enemy is the doubt planted throughout life. Jesus explained that many of these elderly people decades prayed for their children, their grandchildren, their lost faith of entire generations. They prayed silently without recognition, believing that almost nothing would change. But now, in those 8 days, answers would come with a force that surpassed any human logic. Yet many would not believe what they were seeing and feeling. Not for lack of faith, but because they had been conditioned to disbelieve. One of the most disturbing scenes in the vision was when Michael saw an elderly woman in a hospital room. He saw illuminated silhouettes beside her bed. He felt peace, hope, sense that something much greater was about to happen. But when she tried to tell her daughter immediately called the nurse and asked them to adjust her medication. The elderly woman remained silent, believing perhaps she was truly losing lucidity. This is the kind of conflict Jesus showed Michael. Clash between spiritual awakening and the social fear of appearing confused, fragile. How many powerful experiences have stifled by this dynamic? It wasn't all fear. Michael also saw elderly people, even trembling, even without understanding, decided to follow their inner impulse. 87-year-old grandmother woke up in the middle of the night with a strong feeling to pray for her grandson. She didn't know it, but at that very moment, that grandson was about to enter. Her prayer changed his trajectory without her ever knowing. These small acts, invisible to the eyes of the world, were part of the great movement that was emerging. Jesus showed Michael that every elderly person who dared to trust in what they felt would become a point of light in the social darkness. Michael recounted this with a mixture of emotion and despair. Emotion because it was beautiful to see people considered discarded transforming into sources of healing, wisdom, and spiritual power. Despair because many would reject this opportunity for fear of judgment. The question that lingered throughout the account, how many elders on sensing silence. So at the end of this part of the vision, Michael understood that the elderly were not merely part of the plan, they were at its center. They carried a sensitivity that the modern world has lost, openness that the youthful ego rarely. But when this sensitivity manifests, it doesn't emerge as serenity. It emerges as conflict, it emerges as doubt, voice, and it is precisely this point that will lead to the next step of what happens when the awakening of the elderly clashes directly with the social structure, tries to silence them. Part 3 begins precisely at this point of moment when the invisible touches the physical world, society reacts. And according to Michael, this reaction is not gentle. A silent battle that almost no one notices binds the fate of what will. As the vision progressed, Michael realized that the awakening of the elderly would not happen in silence. Every light, when it begins to shine, exposes shadows that were previously comfortably hidden. He saw, almost as if watching an invisible documentary, that between the 4th and 7th of December the resistance would not come from the supernatural, but from people who love the elderly would be first to block what they don't. Worried children, well-intentioned doctors, professionals trained to distrust any behavior outside the norm. It was as if the world itself was afraid of what was about to emerge. The first scene Jesus showed him was inside a clinic. A woman who had spent her entire life serving her community woke up in the middle of a man she said was about to give up on life. The nurse on duty recorded it as mental confusion and increased the sedative. But while she slept, the man she wanted to pray for was actually on a bridge, alone, in the cold, considering jumping. Synchronization was evident, but no one saw it. The inevitable question, how many lives could have been touched if this? Elsewhere in the country, an 84-year-old grandfather began seeking loose out wrongs. His city described places, situations involved in corrupt family, believing he was having a breakdown to emergency room. When Michael recounted this, what was most striking wasn't the content of the vision, how he described the old man's expression, clarity. It was as if for the first time in years his mind was free from confusion and functioning with surgical precision. What if society is interpreting it? What if what seems like confusion? The vision showed that it wasn't just confusion between the physical and the spiritual. It's also a confrontation between two ways of interpreting reality. One that believes only in what can be measured, another that recognizes wealth. The elderly were taught by life to trust their feelings. The modern world, however, has trained them to distrust their own intuition, reducing wisdom to chemistry and spirituality to cognitive dissonance. Michael also witnessed something that deeply disturbed him. In many nursing homes, a supernatural approach, heavy atmosphere arose afterward. He described it as if unseen forces attempted to stifle any spiritual spark before it. Some residents would suddenly become drowsy, others would experience memory lapses, others would feel fear for no reason. It was as if there was a silent effort to prevent them from responding to that inner calling. This raised a disturbing question. Why is there so much resistance when a soul tries to awaken? Jesus then revealed something that fit perfectly with the logic of the showed the war that was happening beneath the surface. Not a physical war, but a psychological emotion. Michael saw social workers and doctors being led without realizing it to interpret everything. He saw family members using the justification of care to prevent their own parents expressing what they saw institutions trying to maintain order at the cost of silencing the ordinary. Not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of social judgment. Fear of the implications of admitting that their will. Jesus showed him something. The elderly were trapped in a social narrative that reduced them to frail bodies, forgetting that their minds carried decades of experiences, traumas, wisdom, collective memory. They were the most prepared to hear what is subtle, the most discouraged from trusting that inner sense. Conflict was not only between science and spirituality, but between identity and its conflict would explode precisely in those. Michael saw a woman trying to tell her son that she had received a very clear dream, a kind of warning. Son, tired, responded irritably, asked her to stop imagining things. Subject. Dream faded, and what would happen next wasn't shown directly, but how often does this happen in real life outside of any vision? While all this was happening, there were also those who said, small group, but enough to create a noticeable. Michael saw elderly people finding the courage to pray for strangers, counsel young people, act with a determination that didn't seem to come from their bodies. They overcame hesitation and followed their inner impulses if they were finally hearing trying to speak lives. Each of their small acts had a direct impact on the atmosphere. Weren't grandiose actions, but precise ones, transformative. Central point of this part of the vision, realization that the elderly were at the center of an invisible psychological battle. Battle between believing what they felt or giving into the fear of seeming inadequate. This battle would decide who would live those days as agonists or as spectators. When Michael finished this part of the account, it became clear that what would come next would be even more intense. The vision was about to show exactly what would happen on the edge. All reach its part 4 begins precisely at this critical moment, on the edge between render. Something powerful is prepared to move forward, because what's coming next affects not only the elderly but the destiny of everyone. As the vision progressed to the 8th day, Michael said he felt something in the air shift. The world itself were holding breath. He described this moment as the exact point between dawn and full light it was at this instant that Jesus led him to an even broader perspective. No longer possible to what he saw now was a spiritual multitude made up of millions of elderly people, not as worn-out bodies. They appeared as luminous, firm figures, a presence and dignity that seemed to expand the space around them. Michael tried to explain this scenario in simple words, but his voice always faltered. He said he never imagined seeing people so old on earth manifest with such force on the spirit. It was as if decades of pain, loss, love, and faith had condensed into a kind of invisible authority. These elderly people didn't walk. They moved forward. They didn't seem tired. They seemed summoned. And most surprisingly, they were all united by the same purpose, as if all that each of them had silently awaited all their lives. One of the scenes that most marked Michael was the figure of a woman who on earth used a cane to barely walk a few meters without help. In the spiritual realm, she stood upright, with a posture that conveyed strength. Her face bore marks of wisdom, not weakness. According to Michael, this woman had lost 2 children, depression, and so, he said it seemed as if all her pain had been transformed into power. How many people like that exist? How many lives already carry accumulated strength without realizing? Jesus showed him unexpected statistics. According to the vision, almost 70% of the elderly carry stories, requests made on lonely nights, promises made amidst family crises, which were never fulfilled simply because no one believed. The number is striking. 7 out of 10 elderly people would have at least once in their lives prayer that changed someone's destiny without it being noticed. When Michael heard this, he understood that these people were not being chosen by chance. They were the living result of years of inner resilience, a kind of strength that doesn't appear in official statistics, shapes entire generations. The most unexpected point of the vision came with the near future. As if opening a window to January and February of 2020, Michael saw nursing homes transformed into healing for people who would never believe it were. It's important to remember that Michael wasn't seeking sensationalism. He described everything simply, almost shyly, but with possibly a bit. He saw nurses witnessing elderly people previously barely spoke begin to advise young people with clarity. He saw doctors intrigued because terminally ill patients showed sudden and inexplicable improvement. Everything happened gradually. Life were reorganizing itself based on the strength of these elderly people. Michael also saw more specific scenes. He saw a group of elderly men in a nursing home in Oregon who used to talk about politics, and after the events of December, these men began to have visions about hidden injustices. They mustered the courage to denounce irregularities, and according to the vision, led to the opening of investigations that changed the local administration. The most curious thing is that on Earth, these men were seen as harmless, just old men saying things seriously, but spiritually they were giants. Another revealing scene, an elderly woman in Miami who for years believed life had been in. She worked as a domestic worker for 4 decades, raising children alone, always feeling too small to make an impact. In Michael's vision, this woman became one of the main spiritual influences. Her ability to listen to, support, and advise young people dozens of lives. It was as if the quiet kindness she had cultivated her whole life finally found space to flourish. And then came the part that Michael described as overwhelming. Jesus showed an army made up entirely of elderly people, not an army of war, but of purpose. They didn't march with weapons, but fiction. This army represented what would happen on December 8th, beginning of an unprecedented spiritual mobilization. According to the vision, the elderly would be responsible for paving the way for their breaking cycles of pain, restoring homes, even influencing governments without ever appearing publicly. It was the invisible force that had always existed, but would now awaken with maximum power. The final scene of this part of the vision left Michael speechless. He saw Jesus walking among, placing his hand on each of the shoulders as recognizing. It was an affirmation that old age was not an end, but the culmination of the. Michael described Jesus' face as a mixture of pride and urgency, as if he were saying, "The world doesn't see, but I do. Now is the time." When Jesus finished showing him this vision, Michael felt that something was approaching, something bigger than he could process. Because if the 8th day was the awakening, the following day's explosion. That's exactly what leads to the next part. The real impact these elders would have on the physical world, breaking limits that seemed impossible. If part 4 revealed the awakening, part 5 shows the movement. Do you want to continue? Because what comes next transforms the entire vision into a doll. Michael was led to what would come after the 8th day. The vision changed so abruptly that he felt as if he had passed through an. Until then, he had seen the spiritual world preparing itself, forming that luminous army of elders. Now he was being back to the physical world. Consequences, ripples that spread after a stone falls into water. It was a silent movement, acceptable, but with the potential to alter everything. He saw January 2026 as if watching a film filtered through light. In the nursing homes, the scenes seemed the same. Nurses pushed doctors passing by with clipboards, televisions on at low volume. But something there was no longer ordinary. For elderly people woke up before sunrise feeling. Many of them got up with the feeling of having dreams important, even if they didn't yet know how to put it into words. It was as if a memory was about to emerge, waiting for the exact moment to manifest itself. Michael saw an 86-year-old woman named Ruth, who had spent the last 2 years in bed. Doctors no longer expected any progress, and the family had accepted that this would be the final state. After the events of December, Ruth began, then her arms, and finally sat up without help. At that moment that something extraordinary happened. She stood up, walked to the bedroom door, touched the shoulder of another elderly woman suffering from chronic pain. Pain subsided almost immediately. The medical team had no explanation. They recorded the event as an unusual response to emotional stimulus, but everyone knew. In another state, Michael saw a retired man who had never been religious, but who suddenly felt an urge to visit his son, whom he had been estranged for over 15 years. He couldn't explain why he felt it couldn't wait. While they talked, the son revealed that he was thinking of giving up on his own. Reunion prevented a tragedy. The young man's entire life was transformed by a decision made in. Michael understood. Stories like these began small, silent, intimate. Hospitals, elderly people who previously avoided social contact began nurses by name, ask about their lives, offer advice that sounded like direct answers to dilemmas that no one had shared. Many professionals felt an initial ring deep, but the discomfort soon gave way to a kind of almost reverent respect. It was clear that those words did not come by chance. Michael also witnessed situations that, if told without context, were improbable to be. An elderly woman who had always been shy and insecure began visiting public schools to talk to students. No one invited her, simply showed up, asked permission to speak, and was hundreds of teenagers. What did she say? Exactly what those. Many were moved, others decided to change destructive habits, and some who lived in isolation decided to ask for help for the first. How did this elderly woman say? She herself didn't know. They only said that she felt she needed to go. Michael then realized that what was happening wasn't just grand in its spiritual appearance and in its subtlety. It wasn't explosions of light, visible phenomena, or spectacular miracles before crowds. It was precise movements in ordinary places by people the world. It was as if God had chosen to work on the margins where no one looks, transform the center where everyone lived. Another striking scene, that of a group of elderly people in a small town who began to eat every morning to walk along streets. They prayed quietly as they walked. There was no heroic physical exertion, no speeches, just slow steps and sincere murmurs. Michael saw, on a spiritual level, those walks functioned like lines drawn in the air. Something dissolved behind them as if visible structures were losing strength. In the following weeks, violence rates fell, cases of addiction decreased, and families that were in conflict began. None of this appeared in the news. Change was perceptible to them. However, what impressed Michael most was observing that this transformation didn't come from extraordinary people, but from ordinary people who had finally understood their worth. Many of these elderly people had spent decades believing it already fulfilled a goal, that nothing more meaningful. Now they were discovering that their entire lives had been a preparation for them. Every pain, every loss, every joy, every forgotten prayer was a piece of the puzzle. It was then that Michael heard the phrase that echoed within him like a profound warning. This is only the surface. His vision darkened for a moment and felt that something bigger, more intense was about to be revealed. What was to come would not only be about healing or reconciliation, but about direct confrontation. Part 6 would be the final revelation about the spiritual, social, and emotional impact of the awakening of the elderly, but also about the resistance that would arise to try to stop them. You've made it this far. Get ready. The next part is the most crucial, where everything converges. Vision reveals who will truly endure, will be forever transformed. When the vision ended, Michael said he felt as if he had placed back in his own body with the silent thunder. Nothing around him had changed. Old studio floor, the smell of smoke, the weight of his body slowly. Inside, everything was different. He said the sensation was like waking from a dream that didn't seem like a dream. Memory of a place more real than life itself. On opening his eyes, he understood that he could not return to the same as once someone sees what he saw, life ceases to become a mission. The final part of the vision was the most intense because it showed not only what was about to happen to the elderly, but what would happen to everyone around them. Michael saw entire families being not of physical illness, but of emotional distance lasted for decades. He saw young people who had completely lost hope rediscover purpose through a simple conversation with their. He saw parents and children forgiving each other. He saw people who had never believed in anything spiritual begin to question everything. Served a transformation that had no logical explanation. But he also saw resistance. He saw people closing their hearts out of fear, shame. He saw families interpreting the awakening of the elderly as mental confusion when in fact it was spiritual clarity. He saw institutions trying to silence this not out of malice, but because they didn't know how to deal with something that didn't fit into their categories. And it was at this point that Michael realized that the question that really matters is not what will happen, but who will be prepared to recognize what. He explained that many elderly people impulses first innate them, that most will ignore these signs because they have been conditioned to think that old age is synonymous with silence, not power, that their time has passed. But according to the vision, it's exactly the opposite. That is why Jesus gave simple but profound for all who truly. First step is internal. About consciously deciding that you will discard your own perceptions. Michael repeatedly stated that Jesus clear. Greatest enemy of manifestation will be. Therefore, the viewer needs to begin by cleansing their heart of old resistance. Doesn't mean forgetting the past, but letting go of guilt and wounds. Sincere conversation, written but unsent letter, or even a silent prayer can begin this cleanse. The second step is structural. Set aside a notebook, a shaper, something physical where you can write down what you feel, dream, or receive during the act of recording gives form to the. And one of the strongest revelations of this vision is that many intuitions, not just for them, but for their documenting is essential. Third step is relation. Choose one or two trusted people, someone who won't someone who is spiritually open. Let them know you're prepared. You don't need to explain everything. Just say if I tell you. Listen carefully. This simple agreement of trust will multiply the power of the experience. The fourth step is practical. Set aside a few minutes each day for silence, reflection, prayer. It doesn't need to be long. 3 minutes can be. An important thing is to create an inner space where spiritual direction can emerge without being stifled by mental noise. Anxiety. Fifth step is courage. Michael said that the hardest part isn't receiving the vision or feeling pulse. The hardest part is acting, talking to a writing an important message, taking an action you've. He emphasized that according to Jesus, faith is proven by actions, not intention. In other words, the viewer needs to decide now that they will not be dominated by the fear of others' judgment. These steps don't require money, physical strength, or youth. They only require inner disposition. According to the vision, it is this disposition. In the end, when Michael told me all this, I remained silent for long. My eyes were wet. Not with sadness, but with a sense of responsibility. He knew the weight of what he carried. He told me that whoever hears his story will also carry, even if only a little, responsibility, not out of fear, but out of choice. Because every person who hears this account needs to honestly ask themselves, if this happens to me, will I recognize it? Will I act? Will I let it pass? The final part of the vision showed elderly people reaching the end of their earthly lives with honor, purpose, and joy they never imagined feeling. They were received not as frail individuals, but as warriors who had finally fulfilled their greater mission. And this image, according to Michael, was not meant to frighten anyone, remind them that there is still much to offer. Age has never nullified a spiritual calling. Only mature. Everything now depends on. Something in this video touched your heart. Don't ignite, reflect, pray, talk. Simple first step. Share in the comments. See anonymously. Hope for story can help someone to continue following this type of deep, reflective, transformative content. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, activate the notification bell. This is not just support for the channel, part of a larger movement that begins in the silence of the heart and spreads when people decide to walk together. First day of December is approaching, and according to everything Michael saw, this could be the beginning of the most significant moment of life. Choose to be awake, available. Choose to be ready. Heaven, as he said, is waiting.